All right, good morning, everyone. It is 11 o'clock Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Pacific Time. So we're going to go ahead and get started, even though we do have a few people still joining us. So we're really glad to have you here today. We're very excited about this topic. We had quite a few people register for this webinar that maybe aren't able to attend it live. So again, a note that it will be recorded and you will receive the recording when we're done. So we'll go ahead and get started. I've got a few introductory slides. Today's topic is growing mushrooms and microgreens with food safety in mind. And we have a very special guest presenter from the Nevada State Department of Agriculture, Alexa Johnson. And this is the third in our annual webinar series related to the FSMA produce safety rule and food safety for fresh produce growers, shippers, packers, holders, and those that work with them, whether they're in an agency or an organization such as Extension. A few quick housekeeping tips to help us keep on track today. And if you're having any issues, it does make your experience a little bit smoother if you can close other programs and windows that are running on your computer. If you're having issues with sound, sometimes it's on our end. You can always put a question into the chat. And if a number of you are having issues, then it might be on our end. But if it's only on your end, then it probably has to do with your system. Sometimes changing the microphone or the speaker that you've got connected to Zoom can help. And the other thing you can do if all else fails is you can call in the phone number that is associated with this Zoom link, and you can listen in on your phone while you watch the video. We have two different ways for you to interact with us and our presenters. One is just to use the general chat, which that goes out to everybody. And then the Q&A, which only goes to us presenters, and we can see and answer those questions either live or we can type in a response. So however you choose to engage with us and with the content today. And again, we will be recording this webinar and we'll post it online, and links will be sent to all of our registered participants. So we're happy to do that, and we'll talk about some of our other recordings here in a little bit. So we have several goals for today. We kind of always like to set the stage with our expectations for the webinar and what we hope that our audience is going to get out of the experience. So number one, we hope that you're going to increase your awareness of food safety risks in the indoor production of microgreens or mushrooms. We're going to also go over some steps that you can take to improve food safety practices related to the culture of these crops, and identify some practices that you can either apply to your own operation or in your work with growers of these crops. So some of you on this call may already be growing these crops. You may be working with growers of these, or you may be considering adding these to your production. And so we're really excited to have so many of you on to learn about this really emerging industry and the special considerations related to food safety that come with them, and really anytime we're growing indoors. So our guest presenter today is Alexa Johnson. I don't know that I've met Alexa in person, but we've been in many of the same working groups and online conferences. And I was just really excited to tap into their knowledge and expertise working with produce growers, and in particular working with some of these emerging indoor agriculture systems. So Alexa is an agriculturist in the Division of Plant Health and Compliance for Produce Safety in the Nevada State Department of Agriculture, and hopefully she can introduce more about herself if I don't get it all right here. But she has worked in produce for almost 15 years. She started doing source verification and organics for a small grower. She was an NSF auditor and worked for one of the largest fruit and vegetable packer shippers in the US, based out of Salinas, California. It's really the heart of produce growing in the country. Before moving on to work with the largest grocery retailer in Canada, doing supplier food safety management as well as quality assurance. So very, very strong background and knowledge and expertise in these subjects. And she now works for the Nevada Department of Agriculture, where she oversees several programs, including Nevada's FSMA Produce Safety Rule Program. If at any time you have questions about what we mean by the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, and the Produce Safety Rule, go ahead and put that in the chat or Q&A. We've taken out some of our introductory slides because we found that by this point, a lot of our attendees are already fairly well-versed in what we're talking about. But if this is new to you, let us know. We're happy to bring you up to speed. So I am going to stop my share here and let Alexa bring up her slides, and we will get started. And I'll have a few things that I want to talk about at the very end. We'll also hopefully have some time for Q&A. I think there are some of you on this call that are actively growing these crops, so it should be a great discussion. All right, that looks good.
Can you guys see my slides, or are you looking at my email? All right, we're perfect. So, all right, again, welcome everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present today, Ariel. And again, my name is Alexa Johnson. And I've been in food safety for quite a long time. Definitely wasn't the path that I planned on. I was going to be an extension agent and wound up getting into food safety and organics and that kind of stuff, and really liked it and have just run with it. Like Ariel said, I worked for a large produce grower in the Salinas area. I managed all of their food safety and their grower compliance on the West Coast, and then they transferred me over to the East Coast, and I did site visits and inspections of growers from Florida all the way up into Canada, and then moved into a large grocery retailer in Canada. And from Idaho, you guys probably know who they are. I don't usually put that in my introduction because people don't recognize the name. I work for a company called Loblaw. And they have several different stores in Canada. And I know that some of you guys from Idaho do get to go across the border and enjoy our neighbors to the north. So you might actually be familiar with Loblaw or No Frills or Real Canadian Superstore. Those were stores that I did stuff with. And one of the things that I really loved that I got to do with them was I got to work with their small and local program, getting direct to store deliveries from small growers so that they could sell in their neighborhood store, which was really cool. And just one of the things that I've learned throughout the years is you always need to be curious and willing to learn. And that's how come I've been so successful with food safety, I think, is because I've always been that way. And so as a grower, I think that's something that's important for people as well. And if you're growing mushrooms and microgreens, you're probably doing it because you are curious and you're wanting to do something that's different than the standard tractors and dirt and seeds. And I applaud you guys for that. So we'll go ahead and get started. I will give you some advanced information on this. This presentation, the slides are fairly general because we're presenting on two different commodities. However, at different places throughout the presentation, I will talk about specific examples that I know of. And just like Ariel said, the mushrooms and microgreens is an area that is really growing really fast right now. A lot of people are interested in it. And so we're trying to stay in front of it. But there may be places where you guys may know more than me. And vice versa. So I think it's something I really like with the way that the FSMA has been set up with states and cooperative extension doing the outreach and that kind of stuff that allows us to learn from each other versus the way it is when it comes from the federal level down, where it's very oversight heavy and less of the back and forth. I like the relationships that we have there. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And I apologize, my presentation is on the farthest screen that I have for me, but my camera is right here. So periodically I will turn to the side just to make sure that I am in the right place. So let's see. So mushrooms and microgreens are a unique form of produce from a food safety perspective, because of the way that they are grown and handled. There's a lot of information on how to grow these things from a production standpoint. You can find YouTube videos, you can find different people who are willing you to sell the whole grow setup, and they will tell you how to get it from when you put it into your soil or into your growing substrate all the way until you have your finished product and you can sell it. But a lot of them are thinking only about production. They're not thinking about looking at this through a food safety lens, especially from the FSMA PSR perspective. And so in the end, our ultimate goal when we're considering food safety from this kind of a perspective is just, we want to prevent contamination. it's easier to prevent it from getting there or minimize the risk of it than it is to eliminate it once it's on your produce. The fact of the matter is microorganisms are everywhere in our environment, and some are good and some are bad. There are some that are beneficial, and they help with breaking down stuff in your soil, making compost, that kind of stuff. And then there's ones that can get in those things and make people sick. They can cause plant disease and they can cause spoilage. So a lot of times your food safety programs, and I think especially with your microgreens and your mushrooms, are going to even help you with other parts of your production, because they're going to help with plant disease and spoilage. If you're controlling access and growth of microorganisms, it's not just going to control the ones that can make people sick. It can be used to control the ones that can make your plants sick or cause them to break down and spoil faster. So, all right. We're going to cover several areas today. This is a pretty long list. And that's why in some places it's going to be pretty general. It's just going to be about thinking about risks. But we're going to go over pre-planting and the things that you should consider before you get started. Health and hygiene, water quality, growing, harvest, post-harvest handling, training, worker hygiene, specifically cleaning and sanitizing and managing pests. This is a term that has a lot of different meanings, and I'm going to use it in the lens of FSMA produce safety. Using good ag practices, or GAPs, through all stages of production can lower food safety risk and even improve quality and shelf life in some instances. When I'm referring to good ag practices, I'm not necessarily referring to the good ag practices audit. I'm referring to an umbrella term that should cover all of the ag practices that you should be doing to grow and provide a safe and wholesome product for your customers, not specifically the GAPS audit. So let's see. Come on. So one of the things that you're going to want to think about before you get started is, I'm going to call them pre-planting considerations. And I know that you don't necessarily plant mushrooms, but it's going to be one of those places where just roll with me on that, because we're covering both mushrooms and microgreens. It's a little bit, the terminology doesn't always match up, but we're going to do our best. So things you want to think about before you get started is, what is the crop being grown? Where are you going to grow it? How are you going to grow it? And are there any risks associated with this crop? And when you're looking at the crop being grown, the where and the how, when you're looking at these, it's not just, I'm going to grow mushrooms and I'm going to grow them in my garage. Okay, that's great. You're going to grow mushrooms. Are there any risks associated with mushrooms that you need to be thinking about? Are there any risks with mushrooms specific to the fact that you're going to be growing them in your garage? And then how are you going to grow them? Are you going to grow them in plastic trays that you put on a shelf? Are you going to be building your own shelves and grow beds for your microgreens or your mushrooms? And what are you going to be building them out of? Can they be clean? Things like that. I've been in mushroom facilities where everything they have is all reusable and can be, they're trays that they put on a shelf and they can be cleaned and sanitized. They were able to run them through. They had an industrial dishwasher like you'd see in a cafeteria or a restaurant. I've also been in a very large mushroom grow facility in Canada that was growing and selling to multiple stores across British Columbia, and they were growing in wooden beds, frames that are all stacked up and in their grow room that they lined with plastic each time, every time they did a new crop. Something that they were phasing out because they couldn't clean and sanitize that wood well. And they were doing it not from a food safety standpoint, but from a plant health standpoint. But still, it's something to consider. You know, sometimes you can start out with one way and maybe it's not the best, but it's the cheapest. Sometimes in the front end, it might be cheap, but then in the long end, it might be more expensive because the added cleaning and sanitation you might need to do. Once you've decided what you're going to grow, what's the source of your spores or your seeds? So I could go right now down the road from me and buy mushroom spores from a guy who grows them in his old tack room of his horse barn. He makes his own growing media. He uses chicken manure from his backyard. I know that's not getting up to the right temperature. to kill any pathogens in it. And I know that I've seen his deal, because he's one of my neighbors. And I would never buy mushrooms from him, let alone spores that I would want to sell to someone else. The same thing for your seeds. Because we're looking at microgreens, those plants we're usually going to be growing our microgreens in some sort of a controlled environment. I've seen people grow what they call baby leaf items or micro leaf items outside in the soil, but most of the time people are growing those in trays inside. They're not going to be growing outside and be exposed to the sun and the air and the wind and the things that would normally help to potentially kill a pathogen off just from time out in the environment. So knowing where your seeds are coming in from and the practices that they're using when they grow them is a good idea. In the day of homesteading and off-grid and a lot of things, you're getting a lot of people who are popping up and seed saving and growing their own things, and that's a really great thing. But there's also a lot of people there who are part of that counterculture that aren't necessarily always using the best food safety practices when they're doing that. And that's fine if that's something that you want to do for your own home and for providing food for your family or whatever. But if you're going to be selling to the public, you want to think about the fact that they're not being exposed to those environmental influences that you have. And so they may not be as immune to some of these pathogens as you will because they're used to them every day. Think about the substrate you're going to be used for growing. Where are you supplying it from? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. How are you going to get it? Is it a soilless substrate? If it's not, do you know the source? What's it been made out of? The process to use it. If you're using compost as part of your media, if you're making it yourself or buying it, does it contain biological amendments of animal origin? And from now on, I'm going to be referring to those as BSAUs. How will the water be used? And is it from a safe source? Are the growing containers, trays, or beds that you're growing in new? If they're used, have all your used containers been cleaned and sanitized in between each grow out? And then what is the water source that you're going to be using for your irrigation / substrate hydration? Are there any conditions in your growing area that could be a food safety risk, such as high humidity, temperature, or proximity to another hazard, like maybe there's a feedlot next door to you? Is there a potential for wildlife intrusion, especially like mushrooms? I understand this is an area that I'm not an expert on mushrooms. Apparently you can grow mushrooms outside on logs that you soak in creeks or ponds. In my deep diving for information, I found information on that. Or is it next to maybe a former industrial site for people who are growing in the suburbs or things like that on a 5-acre lot that they bought or something? What was the former use of your site? Is there any risk associated with that? So those are just all questions you want to think about, and you want to think about them before you get started rather than deal with them after you're started and you've got all this crop and all this investment into it. Health and hygiene. So this is something that I'm going to talk about at the beginning, and I'm going to go more in depth to it specifically with your employees. And there's 2 things here that I'm going to talk about that they fit in a lot of different areas of your production, and one of them is health and hygiene. So people can be a main vector of pathogens into production areas if they don't observe proper health and hygiene practices. Example of being, a sick employee working, poor hand washing, dirty clothing. In these type of systems, preventing the introduction of pathogens is critical. Because of the controlled growing environment, it creates perfect conditions for pathogens to grow and easily spread through all parts of your operation. When you're talking about cold storage facilities or processing facilities, you'll often hear people talk about listeria. And the best comment I heard on that one was, we know that it's there. It comes from the environment. The thing is we don't want pet listeria in our facility. Well, in your mushroom and your microgreen operation, you're going to want to make sure that you don't have pet pathogens, that you're making sure that you're not introducing them from the outside, and then they have the perfect place to live. So they're just going to stay forever, kind of like the raccoons in my garage. Additionally, contaminated human hands, clothing, and personal items may contaminate produce through direct contact. Depending on your type of operation, when someone is leaning over a bed or something to harvest mushrooms, if they are not wearing a clean shirt, it's touching all those other mushrooms that may not quite be harvestable yet, that you're going to be saving for later, depending on what you're doing. So those are things to consider. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about that touches a lot of different areas of your production from the very beginning, from when you first inoculate your media or plant your seeds all the way through your harvest and your packaging and your storage, is water quality. So the quality of the water used throughout production directly impacts the safety and the quality of the produce that's going to be grown and harvested. It doesn't matter if you're growing inside or outside, clean water of appropriate quality for its intended use should be used. There are multiple variables when you're determining whether the water you're using is of appropriate quality for growing. Things that you're going to have to look at is your water source. And I have some things in the parentheses here. And when we're looking at this, there is a great graphic, and I'm sure that Ariel can share that with you guys about the risk of your water sources going from like the safest, or from the most risky to the safest. And so when we're looking at this, open source water is going to be our most risky, moving to well water that's kind of in the middle there, and then to your municipal water, which is usually considered your safest option. When we're looking at talking about open source, this is probably going to be for those growers who are doing mushrooms in logs outside, that they may be soaking them in a pond or a creek before they inoculate them. That is not something that I was even aware of until I started researching on this. And there was actually a decent amount of information on it. I'm not sure that that will work very well in Nevada with as dry and arid as we are, but I know that there's definitely some places in Idaho where you guys get a whole lot more rain than we do. So it might be something that people in Idaho do. I don't know. You want to think about your application method. Again, we're going from more risky to least risky. So direct product contact or sub-irrigation. I know for mushrooms, you're probably not going to be sub-irrigating those, but for your microgreens, you may be putting your media in your trays, planting your seeds, and putting your trays down in water and having it soak up from the bottom. So that's why I said sub-irrigation for this. And then when the water is applied, depending on what your conditions are, you may only be soaking your media, your substrate one time, and then keeping the room moist until that crop is ready to harvest. Or you may be applying water more often, even up to the day of harvest in some situations. So you just need to think about those different variables and how they affect your operation. This is something that I have in here several times, but I think it's important, especially for this one. There's a lot of information and a lot of data. I could talk all day on water, and I'm not going to, because we have other things. So I'm going to tell you, you should reach out to your FSMA PSA team for more information on the requirements for water used when growing covered produce. I know that Ariel and other FSMA teams throughout the US have a tremendous amount of information, and they can definitely help you on that. Remember that water used during growing can contaminate tools or employee hands, and this can happen during growing and harvest activities. And so you should conduct these in a way to eliminate or reduce cross-contamination from your water, especially if you're using a riskier source of water or water that may be draining out of the bottom of your trays or things like that. Water that will contact product or food contact surfaces during harvest or after harvest is called post-harvest water. And it must have no detectable generic E. coli per 100 milliliter sample. That's the one place where I'm going to just outright say that. Like, that is a requirement. And this is talking about like the knives that you use to cut your mushrooms with, or if you use little shears to clip your microgreens. The water you use to clean those has to have no detectable E. coli in it. So, wrong click. When we're talking about growing conditions, which is the next place we're going to go, the growing conditions that we create in our area are very favorable for illness-causing microorganisms. Like, it's perfect for a plant, especially mushrooms and microgreens. And then I'm going to go with the assumption for the most part that most people are going to be growing in an indoor controlled environment. We're making the perfect home for them. They need a place to live. They need some air, they need some water, and they need some food, and they need the temperatures to be perfect. And in most conditions, what we're creating to grow that plant is absolutely perfect for illness-causing microorganisms. These are going to cause symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, aches, fever, diarrhea, and then more serious symptoms, miscarriages, kidney failure, even death. Like, I don't want to scare people, but at the same time, I want people to take this serious, that this can have a serious impact on people. So again, we talked about knowing the source of your spawn and seeds. buying from reputable sources. And it's absolutely okay. Don't be afraid to ask the person who you're buying your spawn from or your seeds, what are their food safety practices? Ask them what they're doing to make sure that this is a safe product, especially when it comes to your spawn. If they're not using good, clean growing practices, not only can it have microorganisms of consequence for human health, it could also mean that you have contamination of other spores in there that could be detrimental to your mushroom grow, that you could end up making people sick that way, or just have mushrooms that you can't sell. What's your substrate that you're using to grow the product in? If you're making your own and make sure that you're handling it in a manner to prevent it from becoming a source of contamination. You know, does it include a BSAW in it? If you're going to have a BSAW in your growing media that you're using for your mushrooms or even your microgreens, has it been treated per the requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule? And so from now on, I'll just say FSMA PSR. If you buy your substrate, what are the ingredients? If the ingredients contain a BSAW, can the supplier provide documentation that it has been treated in a manner that's FSMA PSR compliant? So I can tell you, I went out and did a site visit last year with a grower who was getting started in the microgreens, and she was using a potting soil, a bag mix that she was buying and putting that in her trays. And she had never looked at the ingredients. And when we went through and read the ingredients, we found out that it had feather meal in it and chicken manure. And I was like, can you get any information from this company on whether they're composting it in a way that makes it okay to use, or are they treating it in some other way to kill pathogens? And she had never even thought about that. She had never thought. She was like, I just went to my garden center and tried a couple of the different bags that they had there and found the one that worked the best and I got the best growth for my microgreens. I didn't even think about that. And after that, we told her about, you know, I gave her some recommendations on what she could ask. She sent emails to them. She ended up deciding to go with a local supplier here that we have that does compost in the area. He has a really large operation, and he was able to provide her all of the documentation on his compost, what went in it, when they turned it, how hot it got, all of those kind of things. So she had all of that food safety documentation just by asking. And I was kind of excited about it because it meant that she was supporting a local business rather than just buying something off the shelf that came in and was trucked from a long ways away. I'm always excited when we can support local businesses. I definitely do like my big box stores, but when we can support someone local, that makes me happy as well, especially in our small rural communities. That's important. So hopefully, okay. So I just talked about what is a FSMA compliant BSAW. So the FSMA PSR has very specific requirements on how a BSAW must be composted or treated to eliminate the presence of harmful microorganisms. Typically, when you're talking about compost piles, it's going to be either a static pile or a turned pile. And this is directly from the rule. Static composting that maintains an aerobic, i.e. oxygenated condition at a minimum of 131 degrees Fahrenheit or 55 degrees Celsius for 3 days and is followed by adequate curing. Turn composting that maintains aerobic conditions at a minimum of 131 degrees, 55 degrees Celsius for 15 days with a minimum of 5 turnings and is followed by adequate curing. Or other scientifically valid or controlled composting processes provided that you or they satisfy the requirements of subsection 112.12, including that the alternative has been demonstrated to satisfy the microbial standards in 112.55b. So basically, the only ones I've ever seen for this one that has been something like a pelleted product, like a pelleted seabird guano that was cooked or was steam processed and pelletized at a very high temperature. And they told us, like, we steam process at temperatures exceeding this. They wouldn't tell us the specific ones because they said it was proprietary. And then they had laboratory testing to show that they had a reduction in pathogens when they did that. And we verified that it came from an AOC laboratory, that it was a valid laboratory and test. And so we did accept that. But what I'm going to tell you on this is if you have more questions about this, if you're wanting to start doing your own substrates or soil. Or if you're just curious about the one that you're buying from someone else, reach out to your FSMA team for more information. They're more than willing to help you to evaluate that input and determine whether it's appropriate for what you're wanting to do per FSMA rules. So got a little bit of lag here in my screen changing. I apologize. So, all right. So when you're growing in an enclosed area, harmful microbes can form in difficult to remove, and they form a difficult to remove protective coating. So I'm thinking along the lines of, especially if you're using shelves, or if you have drains or places where you're keeping it wet all the time and you may not be able to be like under trays or something like that, you can have something called a biofilm form. And this is essentially like a coating around a pathogen that protects it. And when things get tough, it reverts back into that coating and it hides out. And when conditions are right, it can escape out of there and start growing and proliferating again. The only way that you're going to get rid of biofilms is through sweat effort, like scrubbing, using a detergent and clean water, and then with a thorough rinse to break up and remove this biofilm once it's formed. Your best bet is to try and prevent it as much as possible. After you've broken up that biofilm with your cleaning process, applying a sanitizer to the surface afterwards is an additional step that can aid in the prevention or elimination of it forming. When you're looking at your grow room for mushrooms or microgreens, having a regular cleaning and sanitizing schedule should be really important to you, and it should focus on specific areas. Growing containers, your trays, your beds, shelves, floors, especially cracks or crevices, places where moisture can gather that may not get taken care of, as say in a daily cleaning, like a sweep up or a mop up. Drains, if you have any wet insulation or walls around pipes and cooling units, things like that, those are places where pathogens can grow, and you definitely want to make sure that you're spending a lot of time focusing on how and when and effectively cleaning them. One of the things that can help, and I'll talk to you about, we're going to go into in just a moment. This is something that is definitely more often seen in big production facilities where they're processing, but I think it's a good way to break down your cleaning areas and make them more manageable. Oops, I think I missed that somewhere. Well, we might come up with a slide on growing zones later on because apparently it's missing. But basically when we're looking at growing zones, those are something that we want to think about, or cleaning zones. So I think I just have some things in the wrong order. I apologize for that. We'll just go with it. We'll go ahead and jump right into harvest. And, oh, I think I put those zones later on. Sorry, I haven't been through this morning again. So harvest, using good harvest practices is really key to reducing the chance for microbial contamination at this part of the process. You want to make sure that the harvest employees maintain good personal hygiene when working around your growing and packaging and storage areas. When you're cutting produce for harvest, don't cut into the growing substrate to avoid contaminating the harvest tool or the cut part of the produce. So like if you're harvesting your mushroom, when you go and cut it off, you don't want to end up and get the tip of your knife down into that substrate. Or when you're clipping your greens, you don't want your scissors contacting that substrate, because that's probably the place where you're going to find the most pathogens possibly in your situation. So you want to just be cutting just above that, the edible portion of the crop that you're going to be selling to the public. And the big part is that's a cut end. It's an open part of your product where pathogens can then enter in. And once they're inside the cells, inside that plant, we can't wash them away. The other thing that we're going to talk about is handling our crops carefully when we're harvesting them. We want to make sure that we're avoiding situations where we're going to bruise them or damage them, because this can cause breakdown in plant tissues, and this is an entry point for bacterial pathogens. If you bruise or drop a harvested produce item, it should be discarded. You know, people think that, oh, it's because I dropped it on the ground and the ground is dirty. Yes, the ground is dirty. And that is a very valid reason. But the other reason is if you drop, say, a mushroom on the ground, it's going to get a small bruise on it. That's going to be the place where it's going to start breaking down faster. And places where you have product breakdown is where the pathogens are going to like to proliferate. So as much as we can to keep the surface of that produce perfect and undamaged will limit the opportunities for pathogen to grow. Care should be taken to prevent contamination of food contact surfaces like your knives, tools, belts, trays, or conveyors, or other harvest items. Don't place personal items or non-harvest tools or any other unclean or contaminated thing in or on these items. You know, one of the things that I used to see a lot with the big harvest crews, and I see it in the small operations as well because we're more casual about it, would be like you're out working in your area and you get hot, so you take your hoodie off. Well, I would very frequently see them put that on the conveyor belt when they were at lunch or something like that. Or when I'm in a small facility, I see people reusing the same container for multiple activities. So they're using a harvest container and it may have garbage in it today. Tomorrow they may be using it to put their mushrooms or their microgreens or their nectarines in. You know, so having designated containers for certain things and making sure that you're only using harvest containers for harvest, which is a clean activity. One of the things I used to tell harvest crews when I would go out to see them is our one job is to keep clean things away from dirty things. And having designated containers when possible for specific activities like clean activities like harvest can be very helpful. You know, I understand that we want to reuse and that kind of stuff. And if you have to do that, make sure that you're cleaning in between each use thoroughly. Never place your knife or your harvest tool directly on the ground or in the growing substrate. Again, that is the part that's going to be cutting that produce where there is an open wound. And so you want to treat that knife or those shears or whatever you're using to harvest as though it is magic, and if it touched the ground, it would disintegrate and fall apart. You want to keep that as clean as possible. All right, so we have our post-harvest activities, and this is going to be things like washing and cooling your produce. Generally, when you're doing post-harvest washing, that's going to be for larger things, usually field crops and that kind of stuff. The considerations you're going to have for food safety are going to be similar. I understand because these systems are smaller and more controlled, this is going to be less common for it to be washed after harvest, but sometimes a grower may choose to do that either because of the conditions, maybe there's a customer request or a requirement that's in place. So if you're doing that, you just want to use caution. Remember that we talked about at the very beginning, the water that you use for post-harvest activities has to have zero detectable E. coli. It needs to be the cleanest water that you would use. You may also choose to cool your produce with a process like hydrocooling or using ice. In the instance of mushrooms or microgreens, especially for small growers going to a farmer's market, you may have a requirement from your health department or whatever that has to be refrigerated or cooled in some way. So you're going to probably be using ice. You want to make sure that you know the source of your ice and that they're using appropriate quality water for that ice, that it is going to be safe to use in your produce. Okay. Oh, I think I went too many slides too far. I apologize. So there was one more. Okay, so when we're talking about your packing, this is really going to be dependent on the size and complexity of your operation. And it's going to vary based on what you're doing. You know, if you're only growing one type of mushroom versus growing 6 or 7 different types, or maybe you only grow pea shoots and someone else is growing lots of different things. That can change all of the things that you may need to consider in your operation as far as when contamination may happen when you're growing or packing your product. After the crops are harvested, some people may decide to pack directly into consumer packaging for sale, or they may transport them to a packing area. It might be even just taking them into a kitchen to process them. Regardless of the method that you're using, always strive to ensure that all your surfaces that will contact harvested produce are clean and sanitized when necessary. Produce quality will start declining immediately upon harvest, and this can increase the risk of foodborne pathogens and how they grow. Cooling your produce as soon as possible after you harvest it will help with a longer shelf life, and it's going to reduce a possible food safety risk because for the most part, these pathogens don't like it when it's cold. They're not going to grow as fast So even if you have a small amount, it may be so much that it's almost undetectable and could cause no issues. But if you're storing them on the counter or at ambient temperature in a shed or something before you take it to the farmer's market the next day, that's a perfect opportunity for pathogens to have that ramp up, that rapid growth phase. And if we can keep them cool, they never enter that phase. They just kind of cruise along, like we talked about the biofilms. When they're cold, they're just kind of hunkered down and not growing or growing very slow. But if we give them the right conditions, warm, moist, food source, protected, they are going to grow exponentially. Like it's like climbing up Everest. So we're going to talk about refrigeration and cooling. And I'm going to talk about this more, and I'll bring some examples in from a small scale because I think that's more what's appropriate for us. So cold storage can help slow the growth of harmful bacteria and microorganisms on produce. Storage areas and refrigerators can also be sources of contamination if the surfaces aren't regularly cleaned and sanitized, if you have any animal intrusion, or if there's condensation that drips on your produce. Storage areas and your transport vehicles, distribution vehicles must be cleaned and sanitized as needed, and the temperature and humidity should be maintained according to the crop that's being stored. If at all possible, do everything you can to prevent condensation. But if it happens, manage it in a way that it won't contact your produce. So I know a lot of people are probably going to be storing using just basic refrigerators, maybe 3 or 4 refrigerators on your back porch. Maybe you're a little bit bigger and you've decided to build a cooler, or you've been able to access a small cooler from somewhere. You want to make sure that those are part of your cleaning and sanitation program. If you're using refrigerators that you have designated areas where certain things are stored. I can't tell you the amount of times that I go out to a small operation, and yeah, they do have the refrigerator on the back porch, but they're storing everything in it, including livestock medicine and vaccines and that kind of stuff. And you want to make sure that you have designated areas. And so one of the things that I used to talk to people about when I went and did global gap audits on the East Coast was thinking about the items that you're storing. If you have combined storage, maybe you're storing your own personal food or other things in that refrigerator with that produce item. Think about what you're stacking on top. So dry things should always be on top and wet things should always be on bottom. If at all possible, have a designated shelf specifically for your mushrooms and your microgreens that are growing, or if you can, have a designated refrigerator. In bigger operations, I've also seen that they will store employee food items in the refrigerated coolers with their things. Having a designated area for your employees to keep their stuff so that they're not going into the area where you have your produce items that you're going to be selling. The less people you have going in and out of there or going in that area, the less opportunity you have for contamination of those items. So those are things to consider. Okay, we're doing okay for time. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is training. In a small operation where it's just you yourself, an annual review of food safety policies and procedures is good. If you have other people who are helping you, and in small operations, this can be family, friends, your neighbor down the road, whatever, you'll need to make sure that anyone who is going to be handling produce through growing and harvest and packing process should be trained at least annually. In smaller operations, you might have workers who move between different areas. You want to make sure, and in a large operation, you might have people who are dedicated. You want to make sure that each person is trained in all of the areas that they're going to grow and the food safety considerations that directly apply to that area. At a minimum, you should provide health and hygiene training for all individuals who handle or touch produce or food contact surfaces. May not be required for FSMA PSR, but I think it's a best practice to provide a basic level of health and hygiene training to anyone who may come into your growing, storage, or packing areas. So even if it's just the local grade school wants to come and take a tour of your operation, having a really quick training on please wash your hands before you enter the area, don't touch anything, please wash your hands after you go to the bathroom or any other time they may have become contaminated, like if you touch your nose or your eyes or your mouth or something that's dirty. just make sure that you wash your hands. If you're not feeling well, please let us know and we'll find something else for you to do, those kind of things. Even though they're just a guest in your operation, I think that's a good basic level because there are opportunities there for that kind of a risk. When should you train your staff or your workers or someone who's coming into your operation? And this includes family members who might be helping you out. The best practice for that is at least once a year. I recommend doing refreshers periodically. You don't have to do the full training all the time, but you can do what I call 5-minute meetings where you talk about one thing like, hey, today let's talk about hand washing. When are you supposed to wash your hands? How are you supposed to wash your hands? Hey, let's talk about harvest tools. When are you supposed to wash and sanitize your harvest tools? How are you supposed to take care of them? You know, you can do things like that throughout the year that keeps that fresh in people's minds. The other one is people need to be trained on your SOPs or your standard operating procedures and your best hygiene practices and your policies for sick and ill employees on a regular basis, but at minimum once a year. And you need to make sure that you're documenting that training when it happens. Who did the training? Who conducted the training? Who took the training? What were they trained on? And when did it happen? And it's always good to attach the training that you did with them as part of that training log. That way, if you get any questions, you have something to hand someone. Here, we did this on this date, and here's all the information they were trained on, and just keep it in a packet. For a small grower, literally having, I used to call them a trapper keeper because that's the generation that I was, but having a binder where you have all your different files in it, you can just slide those in there and keep it that way. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. You can even store them on your computer, in a file cabinet, whatever works for you as long as you have that accessible. Again, we're going to talk about worker hygiene because this is something that is important. Ensuring that workers follow good personal hygiene practices is almost certainly one of the most important things a grower can do to prevent produce from becoming contaminated with pathogens. The following items will reduce this risk of contamination. So making sure that you have clean clothing and shoes, proper hand washing at the start of work, after using the restroom, touching the eyes, ears, nose, or mouth, or any other time they may have become contaminated. Eating and drinking, smoking in designated areas. Again, I'm going to tell you guys, reach out to your FSMA produce safety team for more information. I'm sure they can provide you with trainings, and in some instances, they may be happy to come out and do trainings for you. So cleaning and sanitizing. This is where we are at. I moved it to the end, I forgot. So cleaning and sanitizing requirements must be applied to the equipment, tools, and buildings across the entire operation in the growing and harvesting and packing. Depending on the type of operation and the surface type, the approach, ease, and purpose and frequency of the cleaning will vary. So again, when we were talking about that example of that mushroom grower in Canada who had all of his racks of wooden beds that he had built, his cleaning is going to be a lot different than some of the microgreens growers that I see that are growing on metal baking racks in plastic trays where they can sanitize those trays in between each cleaning. They can take those baking racks outside and hose them off and apply sanitizer to them. So there can be differences in your situation and where you're at, you know, whether you're growing in a garage that you've retrofitted or whether you've brought in a container and built it specifically for it. I've seen some microgreens operations, or at least pictures of them, where people are using the big sea shipping containers. So there's going to be different considerations for those. I know that from using one of those containers for feed and chemical storage, there's issues with heat and condensation with those versus, say, if you had a tough shed built that you specifically had built for it, and then you put in walls on the inside that could be cleaned and sanitized. You're going to have different considerations for the different surfaces, and you want to think about that. And the conditions, you know, you're likely going to have more humidity with your mushrooms than you are with your microgreens, and wanting to be controlling that humidity in different ways. You know, in your microgreens, you might be able to just put a vent fan in and take care of all that moisture that's building up on the walls. But in your mushrooms, you need to keep it more moist. So you've got to think about those kind of things when you're talking about how you're going to clean and how you're going to manage any kind of biofilms, things that are going to grow, pathogens, algae, etc. One of the things that I always see, this has more to do with hand washing, but I also see it in other situations where people think that they can just put sanitizer over the top of it and it's going to take care of everything. And I'm going to tell you that no, you can't sanitize a dirty surface. All of the sanitizers you use, it's kind of like a glass of water. You got your glass of water, your glass of sanitizer, and if you start putting marbles in it, eventually it gets full and it can't hold any more marbles. It's the same thing with your sanitizer. Eventually that sanitizer is going to be all used up from whatever is there, and it won't be able to sanitize anymore. And that's what's happening when you have a dirty surface. So your best practice is to clean and then sanitize. They are two different processes. Cleaning is the process of physically removing the debris or dirt, hair, skin, plant material, or microorganisms that are on a surface. And then using soap or a detergent and some sort of a physical process to mechanically clean it and then rinse it off. Cleaning isn't going to kill microbes. What it's going to do is remove them. It might make them more likely to die off because you may have damaged them in some way, but it's not going to be the way that you kill microbes necessarily. Cleaning should always be done before sanitizing. And if you choose to sanitize, you want to, that's the use of a chemical or a physical process to kill the microbes. When I say a physical process, I'm talking usually about temperature, high heat, UV, things like that. But most often for what most people are going to do for sanitizing is going to be a chemical. And when you're using cleaning and sanitizing chemicals, always make sure that you read the label and that they're approved for the use that you're going to be applying them for. You can't just go to the big box store somewhere and buy any cleaner that you want, like drain cleaner. That's super powerful. I could use that to sanitize everything. Do you really want that on your food contact surfaces? So you want to make sure that they are approved for food contact use or approved for food contact surfaces. You want to read those labels and follow the directions on them, especially when you're talking about your sanitizers. They only work if you use them in the way that they were tested. So a lot of times they will say that, put it on and let it dry on there, or put it on and let it sit on for 5 minutes and then you can rinse it off. And the reason why is it's not a lot of times an instant kill. So you have to have some time where that chemical is sitting there acting on that pathogen or that form of contamination. So you want to make sure that you're reading those instructions and following them. And in some situations, you don't need to do both. In some situations, only cleaning is needed. So, maybe your daily cleaning of your facility is going to include sweeping your floors. I'm not going to tell you you need to sanitize your floors every day. Maybe sweeping them every day is adequate, and so many times a year you're going to go through and decide to do a full cleaning. And a lot of the big cold storage facilities, they will have a regular multiple times a day process where someone is going through and sweeping the floors to take care of the debris and any plant material that's fallen out of boxes or on the floor or something like that. And they will have a daily or a weekly mopping process, and several times a year they'll have a time where they completely empty that facility and do a full sanitation. But on a daily basis, their cleaning usually involves just sweeping. So there are certain times where you don't always have to sanitize after you clean every time. And that's going to be dependent on what you're cleaning, where it's at, how often it's being used, a lot of different things. And this is another place where I didn't put it on the slide, but you can definitely talk to your FSMA team and they will walk through that process and help you with that decision making. So this is where I was talking about earlier. I mentioned zones. I think the idea of breaking your location down into zones is a really great idea. You see it a lot in big facilities. I think it's really great for a small operation as well, because it helps you to chunk what you have to do and decide, okay, these are the most important things. So they're in this zone, and these are the less important things. And so they're in this zone, and it makes it a lot more manageable and a lot less overwhelming sometimes, because sometimes when you're looking at this whole thing and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know where to start. And chunking things into zones is a really good idea. Sometimes they're not in zones 1, 2, 3. I've heard it called ABC, high care, low care, things like that. chunk it in a way that works for you and makes sense and that you're going to understand it. But in this situation, we have it broken down in zones 1 through 4. So zone 1 is a food contact surface or any surface that would directly touch the harvestable portion of the crop. Zone 2 is not a direct food contact surface, but it's in close proximity to it. So the side of the bed, the side of the conveyor belt, things like that. Zone 3 is going to be a non-food contact surfaces in the handling environment, but not likely that the product is going to touch it. So things like the floor, that kind of stuff. The legs on those grow beds, whereas the sides are a zone 2. Zone 4 is areas outside of the production facility. This is just an example, and you can change this. They can be defined differently based on your own workflow. So that's another thing is you want to think about the process of your operation. How do you flow from planting all the way through harvest and packing? Because you're going to have different zones in different stages of the process. And so you want to think about those and take that into consideration. You know, the zones that someone has in a mushroom growing facility may be different than in a microgreens growing facility. It's going to be different based on the type of beds or trays or racks that you're using to grow on. Or if you're one of those microgreens guys that's growing outside. So why is cleaning and sanitizing important? Remember that the growing, harvest, packing, and storing of your produce in a clean environment can do the following for you. It's going to reduce your risk of contamination. It's going to ensure safe produce. It's going to keep any microorganisms from becoming established, both on your food contact surfaces and your non-food contact surfaces. Remember, it's not that hard for it to move from a non-food contact surface to a food contact surface. Even from, say, an employee who does follow all the good health and hygiene rules. They walk in and they touch the side of the bed. And then they go ahead and harvest your crop. Things like that can happen. Make sure that you're using appropriate cleaning and sanitation procedures depending on the type of service. If you do this, it's going to help extend the value of your crop by giving you a longer shelf life. It's also going to prevent spoilage. So like there's a more bang for your buck with that because you're not just taking care of food safety, you're also taking care of your bottom line because the higher quality your crop is and the longer it lasts before you can sell it, the more options you have to sell it and the more money you can make. So, and I know, you know, for a lot of people that is important, you know, the bottom line is important because we can't live on love. Or at least we can't live on love alone. We're going to talk about animals and pests. When you're in a open or a partially enclosed building or growing area, you're going to have to think about risks differently than someone who is fully enclosed. You're going to need to make sure that you're routinely monitoring for things like mice, rats, birds, and take steps to prevent them from becoming established inside your building. Especially if you're in a partially open building, I think the big risk for contamination will be birds that may be flying in and they may nest in the eaves or things like that, or just sit in the eaves. And birds are going to do what birds are going to do. I mean, we've got a parking structure right outside my office that we have to regularly go and get our vehicles cleaned because they're usually covered in feces. And that's just because of the situation that we're in. They don't care whether it's produce. They don't care if it's mushrooms or microgreens or that you're selling it to. The only restaurant I can think right now is the French Laundry in California, but you know, or to the diner down the street. They're just living their best birdie life and they're going to do their thing. So you want to think about those kind of things. And you might want to do things like install screens at entry points, placing bait stations outside of your building and traps on the inside. If you have an issue with an open building where maybe you have birds getting in the eaves or whatever, putting netting up that will keep them from being able to get in those eaves. Make it less desirable for them to want to come into your facility. As I say, make the good thing easy and the bad thing hard. So the good thing would be to stay out of my building. The bad thing would be to come into my building. For a fully enclosed building, you're still going to have issues with this. You've got doors, you've got windows, you've got staff who are coming in and out, who may be leaving those doors open. You never know. You've got to have a way to get your product out of that building and into your transport vehicle. So you still have to have a routine monitoring. You're going to want to think about placing trap stations on each side of your door, around windows. Monitor for your pests. Look for places where they could get in. You know, one of the best things that I always used to do and as an auditor was have them turn lights off if I could and just look around and see what I could see. If I could see light getting in, I knew that a pest could get in. You can install screens over open vents and fans, enhance your baseboard curbing and threshold construction to make a barrier for animals to get in. Things like that. So you just want to think about that. When we're talking about animals and pests, I'll go ahead and talk about, in case someone does think that they want to grow microgreens, or they're the person who's going to try and grow mushrooms outside, you're going to want to think about wildlife and their access to your operation and how they can get in. You're going to want to think about how you can control that, or maybe adjusting the time when you're growing outside or things like that. You just want to take those kind of things into consideration. And so that's kind of one of your pre-plant activities, is doing that. And the other one I always recommend for everyone is keep a log of all of this stuff. You know, it's great to have all these bait stations and monitoring and all that kind of stuff, but if you're not writing it down and keeping track of when and where it happened, you're not going to notice that there's a trend. You know, maybe you always notice that in the fall when they start harvesting grain, that suddenly you have a huge flush of rodents at your facility. So at that point in time, that's a time when you know you need to be more cautious. You need to be more diligent about looking for that kind of stuff. Those are things that you can observe, and by having that documented, you can go back and see the ebb and flow of those kind of things through the year, and that's where records are really a great thing for you. They can help out with that. And then it also means that during times of the year when you don't have as much risk, maybe you can take it down a notch, spend a little less time on it. It helps you to plan your time and use it wisely. And so we talked about birds and animals and that kind of stuff. But the other one is there are insects, mites, aphids, caterpillars, and thrips. They're all common insects, pests that will love the situation that you're providing for them. You've got that growing media. You're going to have moist, damp areas. You may even have standing water. This gives them ideal conditions. It's going to give them to grow, and it's going to be attractive to them. They can damage or stress your crop. They can introduce plant disease. They can introduce microorganisms that are dangerous to human health, pathogens, things like that. In addition to that, these same conditions are attractive to other insects like cockroaches, ants, and flies. And these ones specifically we know can transmit foodborne pathogens. And so they should be handled in a way we want to control that situation to make it as least hospitable to them as possible. And we always want to monitor them. We can use things like biocontrols. You should always use high quality products from a trusted source. Work with a pest control company or an advisor. Talk to your cooperative extension, and get good advice on what to do to control these. And sometimes even the act of your cleaning and sanitation can help take care of some of these as well. So we're getting kind of close to the end, and then I'll just kind of open it up and we can kind of have some roundtable discussions. Because like I said, this is definitely a new area, and I think that there's a lot of information that we can share. One of our when we go into our takeaways, the first line of defense is going to be good personal hygiene. Harvesters need to wash their hands before beginning harvest, before putting on gloves or anything like that if they wear them. If you are providing gloves to anyone who's working in your facility, make sure that they're clean and intact, and that you're following good procedures with those. You know, it's great to provide someone with a pair of gloves, but if they wear the same pair of gloves all week long and they never get cleaned, if they're a reusable pair of gloves, or if they are disposable and they're just using them over and over and over again, it's essentially the dirt from Monday is still on that glove on Friday. And they can be a source of contamination. I feel like properly washed hand is always as good or better than a glove every day. Often when you see people wearing gloves, they're less cautious. You know, if I just wash my hands and I go out to do something, I'm very careful to keep my hands clean. But when I put a pair of gloves on, a lot of times you'll see people, they just don't think about it. It's like, okay, I put them on, I'm good, I'm safe. And caution is somehow thrown to the wind with that level of what they think of as protection. When you're considering your operation, have the harvest process in mind when designing and expanding or reimagining your growing system. Think about all those possible places where you could have contamination enter into the system that could get all the way through to the harvest process. Like I said, I read some stuff on people on the East Coast who literally they are cutting logs and drilling holes in them and tossing them into a creek or into a pond to let them soak, and then they're inoculating them. How does that work? I don't understand that. So like my brain, I'm still trying to figure that one out. And so if I can't figure it out, then I think that there's just an awful lot of opportunities there. You know, if you're growing in a microgreen system, think about the height of your racks. You know, that one that's way up on the top, how are you going to get to it? Are you going to have to get onto a ladder? And then you're now on a ladder right next to other trays of food. And what's on the bottom of your shoes is now exposed potentially to your microgreens on the lower shelves, things like that. Like just because I can build up, maybe I have 12-foot tall ceilings, just because I can build up 12 foot doesn't necessarily mean that's the best thing that I should do to expand my grow. Maybe it might be cheaper than adding square footage to my facility, but in the long run, if someone gets sick, it probably wasn't cheaper. Make sure that you handle your crops carefully when you're harvesting them, because like we said, the damaged plant tissue causes an entry point for bacterial pathogens. When you're harvesting, and depending on the containers you use, you don't want to put your containers directly on the ground. If you're nesting containers, you want to think about the bottom of that container as though it is a food contact surface as well, because it's touching the inside of the other container you're harvesting into. Things like that, that I think that people, like, it's just common practice. If I'm using nesting buckets to nest them all together to move them from one place to the other, and we don't think about that. Like, we know what a food contact surface is, but we don't think about the fact that if I stuck those buckets on the ground and then I nested them all together, what was on the bottom of each of those buckets is now on the inside of the bucket that went on top of it. Things like that. Because of the continuous and intensive nature of microgreens and mushroom growing operations, as well as the proximity you have to your production and packing activities in small operations, effective cleaning and sanitizing is really important. You should have a cleaning and sanitizing schedule. Make it fit the characteristics of your unique operation. Like I said, you know, I really like the idea of zones on a small operation as well, because it makes it easy to chunk those things into manageable tasks. Most of us are doing things like this in our regular life anyway. Some of us learned it from our grandmas, you know, this day is wash day, this day is bathroom day, this day is this day. Why can't we carry those things into our growing operations as well? You know, this day is the day that we clean and scrub the floors. This day is the day that we clean the racks. Things like that. It can make a really daunting process a lot easier when you have an organized way to organize it. And I say drinking quality water here, but basically no E. coli. Make sure that you're using good quality water when you're washing your produce and your food contact surfaces. It's just something that I think is really important. So thank you guys for joining us today. This is the contact information for my team here at the Nevada Department of Agriculture. And we don't care about borders. If you want to call and ask us a question, we are more than willing to answer your questions and help you out. We have quite a few growers. I'm based at the Reno office, and we actually have quite a few growers that come to our farmers markets that are just across the border in California. And I know that I have a lot of not necessarily produce growers, but people who attend our farmers markets and are part of our small programs here that take their livestock up to Idaho to be butchered and bring it back to Nevada to sell at farmers markets. Because right now we don't have a lot of options for USDA inspected facilities. So I don't think that when it comes to food safety that borders matter. I think that we should all be helping each other out. So this is our contact information. We have a general questions email. Yozo Vuheva is our program manager. Lecha Ortiz Carlo is in Southern Nevada, and then I'm here in the Sparks office. So I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions if anyone has them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alexa. This was so much good information. We do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
Zachary, who is a mushroom grower, says, any movement happening on a unified certification regime for mushroom growing in the U.S.? I know that MGAPS is a thing, but as far as required certifications.
MGAPS is the only thing that I know about. And I don't know, I know that that's something that at our meetings this fall that we had with all the different food safety departments, mushrooms and microgreens and hydroponics seem to be an area where there's a lot of growth. But right now, so far, it's just the MGAPs. I think in terms of like a standardized certification regime, that's probably going to be buyer and producer driven. Because we have the FSMA produce safety rule, and while it's definitely a big blanket that covers a lot of things, we feel like it's definitely more of a risk-based one. So we feel like can be adapted to most operations. So I think that from a government and regulatory standpoint, there's probably not going to be anything standardized right now for mushrooms, unless it comes from an industry group, similar to like California that has the Leafy Greens marketing agreement. I think that there's some agreements and different things for tomatoes. And I know that there's one for almonds as well. And a lot of times those have come because of situations, unfortunately.
And
So
just to clarify, so mushrooms and microgreens are both considered produce under the produce safety rule. So
yes,
they would be covered, and your level of coverage depends on how much you sell and who you sell to. Unfortunately, microgreens are not treated as sprouts because sprouts does have its own coverage under the sprout safety. So that's a good thing for now, right?
and actually that's something that we could talk a little bit about, essentially the way it has been explained to me, the difference between microgreens and sprouts has to do with that root and that kind of stuff, and the cotyledons. And I know that some people will sell trays of microgreens, but the intent is not that you're going to be eating the root along with that product. You're still going to be cutting it off of the root and using it in your salad or whatever. So I know that we've had some questions about, well, am I a sprout or am I a microgreen? And so I always ask them, how is it going to end up and be consumed when the person consumes it? And if it's just going to be like, I don't know, my mom grows sprouts on her counter. She breaks all the food safety rules. She eats the whole thing. It's just like in a mason jar. Like, this is a terrible idea, Mom. But the thing is she's eating the whole thing. The cotyledonary leaf, she's eating the little stem and the root and all. But when we're talking about a microgreen, we're usually clipping that off, and it's just that little top portion with the first leaves and that kind of stuff. So that's something I guess I could have mentioned earlier, but I'm glad you brought it up and stirred my memory. Let me see. I'm gonna scroll through. Clean boxes may sometimes be reused if a liner is placed. Yep. Sorry, when I'm presenting, I don't look at the chat at all.
And that's good because you had a lot to cover. So
all right, looks like we have someone who is growing inside and outside in wood chip mulch with municipal water. That's great. If you are using well water, that's also fine. You just want to make sure that you're testing it, and Ariel can give you the information on that. Up there's the water by risk source. And she put compost and that kind of stuff. Let's see. Any thoughts on reusing clean produce boxes from your local grocery store? So you're right. It does save a lot of money and time. I'm going to say that you want to have a really good relationship with that grocery store. Sorry, I can see myself here, but my camera is here, and I feel like I need to be looking someone in the eye and not my camera. It can be a really great idea to save time, but you want to have a good relationship with that grocery store and make sure that they're using good practices when handling those boxes. Having worked in retail, having been in the stores, I'm going to tell you most of the time they collapse them down and they get put in a pile in the back, and they get put in the same, and they're treated like garbage. They're put in the same pile as the boxes that meat came in. They may fall on the ground and get restacked, things like that. So if you can trust the produce guy at your store to save you boxes in a place where they're going to be clean and that kind of stuff, then by all means use them. The other one is if you can put a clean liner in them, you can definitely do that. In the large scale produce industry, they do this. They will use cartons and boxes over, especially spinach will be harvested with a big, basically giant lawnmower, and it goes up on a conveyor, and they'll dump it in a box that is 3 feet wide by 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall. And they reuse those boxes. What they do is put a plastic liner in it. So they, taking a note out of grandma's book and reusing whatever they can. If the big guys can do it, so can you. You just want to make sure that you're doing it with food safety in mind in a hygienic way. And they have procedures for when they start harvest that someone's looking at those big, they call them cardboard bins, making sure that they're in good condition. So if you're going to be reusing boxes, before you use it, before you fill it, always look at it. And if it looks even a little bit funny, when in doubt, throw it out.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really good and really helpful. Oh, we got one more question. Oh, this is a good one.
I'm gonna
So
say
the
that's state by
question-
state.
Yes.
For us, they would be counted not as a cottage food. We would send people to the health department, depending on what they're doing with their dried mushroom products. Because a lot of times our dried mushroom people are slicing them and drying them or doing things like that. So I would say contact your state Department of Agriculture and your local health department on that, because it's really going to depend on where you're at.
Yeah, and in Idaho, this would definitely be something that is under the jurisdiction of your local health district and their food program, to determine what the risk is and whether it would count as a cottage food or not. So, and I would have to do a little digging to know that one for sure. And I'm always happy to ask those questions for you, so you can reach out to me. I'm going to put my email in the chat again. You all should have it because you signed up for this email for the webinars. But if you have questions regarding any of the things that we talked about today, more about FSMA, etc., just reach out to us. We are happy to help. I've got to pull up my final screens really quick,
Okay.
just to kind of give us the send off. But this has been really beneficial, and I really appreciate your time and your attention to this, and for helping us to understand all of these things. So just really quick, okay. Okay, like I said, this was the third in our series this year. The other two have been recorded, and I will be putting them up onto our YouTube page so that you can view them. I'll also be sending out those links to anyone that registered for any or all of the webinars. And we'll be putting some supplemental resources out there too. Just to remind you, when you do get that link, all of our former webinars and training videos are all on that YouTube channel. So if you're needing to increase your learning this year or to get some education credits, we've got over 13 hours of webinars designed to prepare you for successful inspection or to really just tighten up your food safety practices on farm. When this webinar closes, you will be given the chance to answer I don't even think it'll be 3 minutes. It might even be like 45 seconds. It's 4 questions really quick about today's webinar. It really helps us to design webinar series that are beneficial to you as growers and as those who help growers. And it will help us to plan for next year and to think about what we're doing there. So I want to thank Alexa and thank her team in Nevada for sparing her for today to share with us. Very valuable. I hope to meet you in person soon at a multi-state or regional food safety event. And yeah, thank you so much. Any parting words?
I'm good. We also do training series, so if you ever want to join those, just reach out to Ariel and she can put us you in contact with us, and you're more than welcome to join ours. And I'm definitely going to let our growers know about the recordings that you have as well.
Wonderful. All right, everyone. Thanks for staying a little bit longer. I think it was worth it. Have a great afternoon.